Kandersky, and I'm the first speaker on the affirmation or government side of this debate. Today, I strongly affirm the resolution that as a family that could comfortably afford it, we would choose not to place our school age child in a learning pod during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, top of case, some observations. This is a policy round as indicated by the word should. We're going to be treating this as an action that we are undertaking and the potential impacts of that action. Now, the actor is a family that could comfortably afford to place their child in a learning pod as indicated by the resolution. This would be a family that clearly has enough resources to afford to both send their child to a learning pod and also to have the resources to sustain their child at home. We will also be discussing the effects of learning pods in the US specifically. Definition. So, what is a learning pod? A pandemic pod or a homeschooling pod is where there's groups of 3 to 10 students that learn together in homes under the tutelage of the children's parents or a hired teacher. More often than not, this is a hired teacher. Now, some background on this issue. Currently, the parents of school age children are given 2 options. You either have to stay at home and do school online or participate in these learning pods. The burden of the affirmation here is to prove that a family would choose to do online schooling and should choose to do online schooling. And the burden of the neg is to prove that they should not they would rather do these learning pods and thus should place their child in a learning pod. Now, our first advantage is that of COVID-19 spread. Uniqueness or what's happening in the world right now. Right now, COVID cases are increasing the status quo at an alarming rate. Yesterday, we hit the second highest number of cases per day ever recorded in the pandemic, including a 32% increase in cases in New York, a state that was once recovering. So, point B, experts say that we are hitting the third wave of the pandemic, not only in the US, but also in other European nations. And finally, with Trump recovered from COVID, many of his supporters have been even more lenient with mask regulations since they believe it won't affect them. So we're seeing a situation that is not ameliorating itself, and we clearly cannot afford to place children in environments that could potentially expose them to COVID. Now onto the links or what the plan does. So what's going to happen if a parent should choose to put their child in a learning pod? Now, officials in many states are warning of spread due to pods. The Oregon Department of Health recently asked families to think twice before setting up neighborhood learning pods, saying it would spread COVID-19 and ultimately keep kids from returning to the classroom. Additionally, the Oregon Department of Education warned that as families choose to come together either informally or through community organizations, COVID-19 is more likely to spread and could lengthen the time before schools can return to in-person classes. Even a small group of people can lead to a large number of cases. Now, secondly here, if families participate in one pod, they're going to have children of other ages participating in other pods with other families. This exposure risk quickly multiplies. So say a family has multiple children. Obviously, you have to have pods with the same age children because they're all in the same grade. So you're potentially multiplying the risk of COVID by having these multiple pods that you interact with on the regular. Additionally, pods often meet in families' homes. So the responsibility of cleaning, tracking symptoms, and enforcing mask wearing falls on the parents who have their own jobs outside of sanitizing their home every single day and therefore will fail to meet the requirements. Now, link number 3 here is the law. Interpod contact is inevitable amongst learning pods. In groups of 5 to 10, with elementary schools with as many as 300 people, it is impossible to find enough teachers to adequately tend to each pod, which means one of 2 things. Either one, parents are going to have to lead these pods, which means that these children are going to have access to subpar education because parents are not teachers. Or 2, you're going to have students or you're going to have teachers that teach multiple pods, which means that they are literally breaking most state coronavirus laws. Most state coronavirus laws do not allow for people to interact with people outside of group of 10 to 12, which means that teachers will have to both break the law and potentially expose multiple groups of students to COVID-19. So like I stated before, there's 2 possible things that happen. Number 1, you have your parent teach you, which means that there's absolutely no benefit to a pod, or you have to quite literally break the law to make sure there's enough teachers to go around. Now, 4, with online schooling. So why would a parent choose online schooling over this learning pod? Online schooling means there is a 0% chance of contact between students, thoroughly reducing the spread of COVID-19. In choosing to place their child in online school rather than in a pod, parents are choosing to lower the risk that their child gets COVID-19 through schooling to 0%. The spring closure in schooling is what led to the massive decrease in initial COVID cases in the US. This is visible in graphs and data. You see that schooling closure had a massive impact on the potential spread of COVID-19, and you're potentially going to go back on the progress we've you've made here to put your child in a pod. Now, the impacts here. Number one, you're going to have longer online schooling if COVID breaks out in one of these pods, and which ultimately means that if they state that online schooling is bad, that in-person learning is good, we might agree there, but ultimately in choosing to place their child in a pod, you're elongating the amount of time that students have to spend in online schooling because you're having COVID outbreaks. Two, you're decreasing the quality of life of these children. Think about it. If you get coronavirus, or if your friend gets coronavirus, if just one child in one of these pods potentially gets sick, these kids will not have a good quality of life because they're scared for either themselves or their friends. And three, there is the possibility of death here. I mean, COVID-19 is a deadly disease, and if one of these children contracts the disease, there is the possibility that they could die, which is a very big impact in this round. Now, our second point, or our second advantage, is that of structural violence. The uniqueness here. According to a study from the Becker-Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago, 63% of jobs cannot be done from home, and these jobs are disproportionately lower paid. This means that lower income families are in fact more likely to need pods because the parents are more likely to go off to work. Secondly, more than 9 million children lack adequate internet access at home, which means that distance learning is very difficult to attend. Almost all of these students are socioeconomically disadvantaged. Now, the links here. Number one, pods are very expensive, which means that lower income students cannot afford them. It literally says this in the resolution. When asked if they plan to join a pod, several parents surveyed this week in an Ipsos-run community panel of 310 parents said the cost for pods or even moderately priced tutoring was not financially achievable. Now, secondly, like I mentioned before, there's a limited amount of teachers. As I stated, there's not enough teachers to go around in groups of 5 to 10. If teachers choose not to break state guidelines and stick with a single pod, this means that students who can't afford it will be shut out, quite literally, of the benefits that pods have to offer. In paying exorbitant amounts of money to place their children in a pod, affluent parents are taking away resources from the children that truly need individualized learning the most. The impacts of this, number one, a decreased quality of life. It is these socioeconomically disadvantaged children that actually need distance learning due to lack of internet access and a lack of parental supervision at home because their parents have to go work. This means that affluent students are less likely to need these benefits. Secondly, you're seeing potential increased poverty and widened education gaps because they're not getting access to as high quality of education. For these reasons, I urge a strong vote for the affirmation.
So I'm gonna hang up on my partner on the phone. Yeah, okay, we're good. Okay, so I will start my time now. So first I want to contest a small part of their definitions that is actually going to be a big factor in this round. They define a person who can afford a learning pod as somebody who can afford it as well as being able to take care of their child at home. This is like it is an unfair assumption to make because there's nowhere in the res where it really says that the person has to be able to support their child at home for free as well as a learning pod. It takes away a lot of the negations ground, and it simply doesn't really abide by the res very much. It's just like something that they added to make their case easier to win. So firstly, I will get into our contentions. The first one is about the importance of social connection. First, actually, I'm going to pause my time. Trigger warning, I will be talking about mental health and things like self-harm and suicide. If anybody is not okay with that, can you please tell me now and I will not talk about it, if that will be triggering to you. Okay, cool. Then I will resume my time. So right now, suicide has been and is increasingly becoming the leading cause of death for teenagers, and teenagers' mental health is only decreasing during distance learning. A CDC study that was conducted in June showed that almost every young person is saying that their mental health is lower than it was before the pandemic and lockdown started. especially with teenagers, not being with people increases their risk of depression and anxiety, as well as mental instability. When we interact with people, a chemical called oxytocin is released, therefore regulating our mental health and our mood. This decreases the chances of us doing something drastic, such as self-harm or suicide, and just overall decreases the risk for severe depression. Secondly, about younger school age children. The first 8 years are essential for one's brain development. Things like life success and learning and social interactions are essential for children who are young, especially. They need to develop social skills. This is something that is extremely important in education for young people, and that is why a lot of elementary school focuses on group projects and stuff like that. So what are the length of this? When you put your child in a learning pod, you ensure that their mental health is maintained. It decreases teenagers, especially, risk of self-harm and suicide, things that are extremely pressing right now and that are extremely prominent in households, especially with people who have abusive parents, especially with people who have already been diagnosed with depression, and just any teenager, period, because suicide rates are increasing, and suicide is already the leading cause of death for teenagers, and learning pods will directly prevent this by allowing teenagers to have social interactions. Secondly, it ensures that the child who is younger will be able to have proper brain development and proper social skills. This means that it ensures that they will be able to learn adequately, as well as they will be able to have adequate social skills in order to avoid getting bullied later on in life, because not developing your social skills increases your chances of bullying later on in life, which leads to extreme isolation and mental health issues. So the impacts of this are that parents are preventing the mental health harms that come along with distance learning. Secondly, a lot of children with learning disabilities are struggling right now and need learning pods. So a lot of kids with processing disorder, Down syndrome, autism, etc., have IEPs and specific learning specialists that they work with in the school that are provided by the school for free. So when you're talking about a kid with a disability, if you were to put them in a learning pod, it would be free because that is regulated by the school. Also just things like ADHD and dyslexia, not necessarily people will have IEPs for this, but it is much harder for them to learn. So the links of this, putting your child in a learning pod, kids with learning disabilities are able to be okay. They're not disadvantaged when it comes to going to college and other things like that. A lot of parents of people with learning disabilities have said that they're actually going to hold their kid back because they're so incapable of doing distance learning, and they're not going to be equipped to go on to the next grade. This puts kids with a learning disability at an academic disadvantage, especially when applying to colleges and other things like that. They will not have the same opportunities as children who don't have learning disabilities, either because their grades are suffering or because they're being held back because they simply cannot cope with distance learning. We all know that going to college, getting a college degree is essential for getting a good job in life, and essential for a high quality of life once you are out of school. So this is incredibly important. Thirdly, working parents. There was some points of clash, and I'll get into that later. But 70% of working parents rely on daycares. This was before the COVID-19 pandemic, but there are still so many parents who are not working from home, who are on the front lines in high-paying jobs and in low-paying jobs. So right now, parents are having to choose whether or not they leave their kid at home by themselves or don't work. Both of these are terrible decisions to make. Okay, one of them, you're putting your child in danger, especially if they're a young child. You are putting them in danger of a lot of things by leaving them at home. You are also making it almost impossible for them to actually do distance learning, because a lot of kids need help setting up their Zooms and stuff because they don't know how to read. Or you have to not go to work, therefore decreasing your family's income, putting you at a higher chance of not being able to access food, not being able to pay your rent. So this is a terrible decision that can be solved by putting your child in a learning pod. In a learning pod, the children are safe, and the parents can work at the same time, therefore maintaining the economic stability within the household, as well as the child's well-being, safety, and quality of learning. So firstly, onto their COVID contention, they say that learning pods inherently increase the amount of COVID cases. However, this relies a lot on the fact that these families would be responsible outside of learning pods. If they didn't have a learning pod, they would not socialize. They would follow all of the COVID-19 guidelines exactly. And we can see that this is simply not realistic within the status quo. Personally, I see, and I think every judge here sees, people who go to restaurants without their masks in big crowds that definitely are maybe legal, but are not good for the spread of COVID-19. So because many people are going out and already not social distancing and doing things like that, it is advantageous to put your child in a learning pod, because if you're going to break COVID-19 regulations, or even if they're not laws, you might as well do it in a productive manner. Secondly, the COVID cases within New York schools, they brought up New York as an example, are actually fairly low. So maybe the overall population is increasing in cases. However, out of 10,000 students who were tested, only 18 tested positive within the New York school system. They said that that it will slow down schools reopening. However, schools are being slowed down due to people breaking guidelines outside of pods. The impact of people breaking guidelines outside of pods outweighs the impact of people who are breaking guidelines within pods. So pods do not have the capability to slow down the reopening of schools so exponentially. There's my time. So.
Okay, so for a quick off-time roadmap, I'll actually just be going in the same order that negation went. So I will begin by reviewing that definition and then moving on to responding to the negs case and then defending our own. Are there any questions? Okay. Okay, my time starts now. Hello, Judge. I will be strongly affirming the resolution. This House, as a family that could comfortably afford it, would choose not to place their school-age child in a learning pod during the COVID-19 pandemic. When looking at this definition, let's look at a key word in this resolution. We see the word comfortably afford it, which means that they would have the resources to be able to provide for their child at home. They say that this is an unfair assumption. However, it is not an unfair assumption to assume that a comfortably wealthy family can afford a babysitter, which would only contact with their one family and would reduce the spread way more than learning pods would. And also, it would probably mean that they could sustain their child at home, which means that you have to be able to pay for iPads and other equipment at home that is necessary for online learning. It is not an unfair assumption to say that they can actually provide for their child if they have enough money to do so. It is clearly not unfair, especially because of the key word here, which is comfortably. Okay, now moving on to their case. So their first point is about social interaction, but we actually see that online learning has been incredibly beneficial towards mental health, and it's because it's more flexible. We see that a lot of mental health, especially with anxiety and depression, comes from stress, and because online learning is much more flexible than actually going to in-person learning, we see that stress overall has decreased. Online courses, especially college online courses, can be quite beneficial to a busy student. The courses are flexible as far as time management because students don't have to commute and sit in a class at a given time during week. Online classes can often be more cost effective as well than traditional classes and can be done at a pace the student is more comfortable with. A lot of times you just need a break from school and you need a mental health day, and you're able to do that with online classes because you are able to go at a pace that the student is more comfortable with. But when you're in a learning pod, you're just doing it with the other students. You don't have that flexibility that is given with online courses that is incredibly beneficial towards mental health. In addition, for middle and high schoolers, the logistics of online courses can also be beneficial. Adding online classes to their regular class load can help struggling or at-risk students, especially those with learning disabilities, to make up failed or missed credits attributed to truancy and being transient. by being able to catch up online, students can graduate on time with their classmates, which actually provides an advantage to these students that they talk about that have these learning disabilities. This is only possible through online learning, because otherwise you're just modeling in-person learning and like saying it's technically safer when it clearly isn't. Now, we agree mental health is super important, but ultimately in promoting the possibility of outbreaks, you lengthen the amount of times that students spend in distance learning. It's ultimately better to just have online learning completely for a month and then be able to go fully online to solve all of these mental health issues with social interaction that they talk about. We are ultimately saving time before like providing the most social interaction, because we'll be able to go back to in-person learning quicker, because with these learning pods, COVID is just going to be increasing and increasing, which means that you'll stay in these learning pods for like months and months, because the spread is just going to be increasing and you won't be able to go back into in-person learning. They do not respond to this point, so you have to flow this through. You're ultimately going to be worse for mental health with these learning pods, because we see that 3 to 10 people are simply not enough for social interaction to even like have a great impact on mental health. The only way you're able to do this is by going fully in person, but the only way that is possible is if everyone chooses online learning instead. Ultimately, if the affirmation side is clearly much better for mental health. And now they talk about a lot of their link chains is that I'll take it after I respond. A lot of their link chains here were that like learning pods would be free. However, again, that technically that's not necessary. Parents that can afford it do it. So that doesn't even fall under their res. All of their impacts and things about how like people with disadvantage are disadvantaged like socioeconomically do not apply here. While in theory a 504 would provide for a pod, many school districts will fail to provide this for their students. We see that like with learning pods especially, the majority of school districts aren't able to afford to pay teachers to like full time to support only 10 students. Like usually class sizes are 30 people and they already struggle to pay their teachers. Imagine if schools tried to provide for a one teacher per 10 students when there's already a lack of teachers. And again, they like talk about learning disabilities. However, we say that were actually more beneficial to these people because they were able to go at their own pace more. They're able to take a day off without putting their other kids in their learning pod at risk. Now, they bring up the statistics about how like working parents like rely on daycare like for 70% of the time. However, again, we see this statistic has completely changed because of COVID, because most parents are working from home. And ultimately, them hiring one babysitter is better than having a teacher that goes to 10 different pods with your 3 kids that each have 10 people that they also are with. That's like almost 100 people that you're in contact with versus one person. Ultimately, and we see that these wealthy parents are able to afford that one babysitter or that one person that they need if they absolutely need it. But we also see that most of the time they don't need it because they are working from home. Look to the multiple scenarios we provided you where we prove that the limited amount of teachers means that students are shut out. We see that especially like they didn't respond to any of our structural violence points, so you should flow that through. But these students are being shut out from actually getting access to this education in the first place, which is ultimately much, much worse than any of the impacts that they talk about. Okay. Now let's move on to our case. They make one response on our COVID advantage and that is that our like case relies on the fact that these parents wouldn't follow all these regulations exactly. Let me prove to you why this is actually faulty logic. This is simply not true. If these parents make the decision to put their kids at risk and choose a learning pod over making the safe choice of online learning, it is fair to assume that they will be more lenient with other things as well because they already made the bad choice, which means that they're not going to like follow other regulations because they're more lenient. They already made the bad decision. There's nothing stopping them from making more bad decisions whatsoever. Like, in fact, like even at my own school, the football team had pods and they all now have COVID because they went out partying after. Like it's impossible to assume that every single parent will follow the rules. Even if you make the assumption that like, let's say 50% of the parents will follow every single rule, the other 50 won't, that is still increasing their chances. It's still way higher than online learning. Now they bring up this statistic to say that students in New York don't have COVID. However, you do realize that they have online learning in New York. It's almost entirely online learning still in New York. That is why they have so little cases. And that's another reason why you should vote AF. And again, they talk about the impact, and they say that they're breaking these guidelines because for other reasons aside from online schooling. But look to the fact that they don't respond to our point about how spring closure specifically is what led to the slowing of cases. The spring closure of schools is the reason why. And again, teachers teaching multiple pods is breaking a guideline. You are literally doing something illegal with these learning pods. Okay. Now we'll move on to extending our second advantage, which they have not responded to whatsoever. This should be completely flowed through. It should be prioritized in this round, since structural violence is the internal link to mental health and mental illness. We see that a lot of, especially kids that face racism in school, which is going to be increased with these learning pods, because you're literally increasing the gap between them, the learning gap between them. We see that it is actually worse for mental health, this racism impact, which means that this should be prioritized off of all of these. Look to the fact that pods are too expensive. They're not financially accessible. You are literally taking away resources from the people that need them most. These wealthy kids do not need this. It's just going to lead to a decreased quality of life. This is a huge voting issue. For those reasons and more, it's a clear affirmation ballot.
Okay, I'm Kai Tigan. I'm second speaker for the opposition. I should need a second to set up my timer. My flow. Okay. By the way, if you have a POI, please just say it, because I'm going to be using a tab for my flow, so I won't be able to see your hand. Okay. So just brief off time roadmap. We're going to talk about their contentions and our own contentions and points of clash. Okay, so just to start this speech, I would say that there's actually a fairly glaring point of clash, which my partner briefly touched on in her first speech, which is the matter of learning pods. Now, a lot of our opponent's case rests on the inherent assumption that the learning pod is something that is incredibly expensive, and that to have a learning pod, you need to have a lot of resources, and that to be able to comfortably afford a learning pod, you must be an upper-class parent. And judge, this is simply not true. The fact of the matter is that a learning pod is very simple, as clearly defined by them in a definition that we mostly agree with, right? A learning pod is essentially just a group of several students, 3, maybe 4, who are coming together to learn together and to collaborate in person in terms of schooling. This is all. They might have a parent to take care of them. They might have a tutor depending on their resources, whatever. The point being that a learning pod is not inherently expensive, and a lot of their case rests on this. In fact, their entire second contention rests on this. Their entire second contention is essentially stating, okay, so if high-income parents are taking learning pods, and of course, only high-income parents would be able to afford learning pods, then there will be no learning pods or teachers for low-income parents. But this is a self-contradictory statement, because simply by making this contention, they're essentially agreeing with our point that learning pods can be made available to low-income students. Learning pods are not inherently expensive, and so there is not an issue of structural violence here. So you can strike the entire contention from the flow, because it entirely rests on this one point of clash, which you can see that we win. Again, they provide no warrants, they provide no backing for why a learning pod is inherently expensive. They didn't explain their reasoning. They just said it's expensive and then rested their entire case on that. So unless they can adequately argue against this point, you can strike their entire second contention from the flow. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about their refutations to our mental health contentions. So they said that it would be better to just wait a month doing distance learning and then go back to in-person school, right? We have a couple of points against this. So first start, it's been, 6-7 months now of lockdown, and people aren't going back. And the fact of the matter is, people aren't going back to in-person school anytime soon. And here's why. To go back to in-person school entirely safely, you either need a vaccine or herd immunity, right? And this is not going to happen as long as people are continuing to break COVID regulations in any way. Their assumption kind of rests on this idea that people aren't going to be irresponsible, but they say that some people will, and we'll get into that later. But the problem with their idea of, okay, we should have to wait a little bit longer in our little distance learning situation, and then we'll be able to go back to in-person school sooner. The problem with that idea is that, again, you are not going to be able to go back to in-person school until there is a vaccine or herd immunity, or just literally no one is breaking regulations, which is frankly implausible, right? So they're bringing up a scenario that is never going to happen anytime soon. They say we'll be back at in-person school in a month. This is ridiculous. We're not going to have a vaccine in a month. We can wait. We can hope that we will have one soon, but we will not be able to go back to in-person school anytime soon, regardless of learning pods. Learning pods are not going to make a situation where people can't go back to in-person school sooner. And a lot of their case rests on this because they say, oh, we're actually better for mental health because students will be able to go back to in-person school sooner because the learning pods won't be spreading COVID. Okay, so actually, just to add on to that, they had another brief point, which I was very confused by. They said, oh, everyone knows that having 2 or 3 people to connect with just isn't good enough. But frankly, they provide no warrants for this, and this statement is nonsensical. There is no specific thing that says, oh, you need more people to be able to connect, to be able to get oxytocin, to be able to stabilize yourself, and to be able to feel emotionally stable. You could feel perfectly emotionally stable only connecting to 2 or 3 people, because the fact of the matter is it's a matter of being alone, right, doing distance learning, or being with people in your learning pod. We solve for this issue by having learning pods, and they do not. They dismiss the extremely positive effects of being in a small pod with 2 or 3 people, because even being able to connect to those 2 or 3 people would make a world of difference to so many lonely, isolated teenagers. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. Oh, another point that they made, which again, I was a little bit confused by. So they said that parents who are putting their children into learning pods must be irresponsible, because this is an inherently irresponsible decision. And what this means is that they're probably making other bad choices too, which makes learning pods even more dangerous. But again, I have to strongly disagree with this statement. I do not think it is in any way irresponsible to be concerned about the mental health and safety of your child. And in fact, I think parents putting their children into learning pods might make them more careful in the rest of their life. And here's why. Parents are concerned about the safety of their children. As we said, right? Parents don't want their children to get sick. That's just a responsible parent thing to think. And that is the situation for most parents. And if they're saying to themselves, okay, we're going to be putting our children into a pod with these other children, the parents who are the parents of the children in this pod will need to agree that they're going to be safe. Right? They'll need to agree that outside of the learning pod and outside of their homes, they're being safe and smart and making safe, smart decisions, because otherwise they're not going to feel comfortable necessarily podding together, right? So I would actually argue that their point can be turned against them, because in some ways, parents choosing to put their children into learning pods might make them more responsible in other areas of their life, because they're choosing to protect their child, and they realize that if they're irresponsible in other areas and they're engaged in a learning pod, they could potentially be endangering whole groups of families. So we talked about why their second contention can basically be entirely struck. We'll talk a little bit more about their COVID-19 spread contention, which is again an area of many points of clash. So they talked about how the March closure of schools directly correlated with a decrease in cases, and they're correct. But the thing is, there is a world of difference between full in-person school with hundreds, potentially thousands of students, and a learning pod of 2 or 3 people. A world of difference. You're connected to people, but in one case, you're connected to 2 or 3 people, and I guess their families, right? In the other case, you have a situation where you're at a school with all of the students constantly passing them in the hallways and having a ton of problematic situations, right? This just doesn't make sense. They're trying to correlate 2 issues which are on very far ends of the spectrum, because while they both include potentially exposing yourself to other students, one is only 2 or 3 other students, and the other is potential hundreds, thousands, etc. It's a world of difference. Let's talk a little bit about their only response to our learning disability point, which was that distance learning allows you more time to pace yourself on your own terms. You can take mental health days and be okay and catch up on work, right? But first of all, I think that they're kind of misunderstanding the nature of some learning disabilities, because some people with learning disabilities genuinely just need structure, right? They need someone to provide them with scaffolding and support so they can stay on top of things, because otherwise things might slip through the cracks. And so their point can actually work against them here, because they say, oh, you can do it self-paced, you can do it on your own time, you can do it independently. But the thing is, for a lot of students, that's really, really difficult. If you have a learning disability or a processing disorder like ADHD, it's hard to be able to focus on that type of thing and to be able to make the necessary routines and positive study habits to be able to cover all of your work on your own. And so their only point really actually stands against them on this point. And you can flow this point through to our side, that our idea solves for students with learning disabilities, right? In a learning pod, they're going to be able to receive much more scaffolding and support, and it's far less likely for them to fall behind and to fall through the cracks. Their point does not. In fact, when they are only able to manage themselves and they're having to do everything solo and not being provided with scaffolding and support, they're going to have a problem, because they're going to allow things to slip through the cracks. Again, the nature of learning disability means that this is an inevitability. And so also, schools are mandated to provide for the 504 mandate in terms of taking care of the potential costs of distance learning pods. So this point is just entirely irrelevant. They made a point that some schools are not going to be able to provide for this, but this is just patently untrue. Schools are mandated to provide for this legally. They need to follow their regulations. So again, you can see how we solve for the COVID-19 crisis, right? And how their ideas that by just staying in distance learning for a little bit longer, we'll be able to go back to full in-person school is completely flawed. You can see how we solve for mental health and they do nothing to address it. You can see how we solve for learning disabilities. You can see how their point about structural violence is completely irrelevant because a learning pod is not necessarily expensive and their entire case rests on this. For all of these reasons, you need to vote for the opposition. Thank you so much.
Okay, let's get right into it. Okay, so let's talk about the main points of Clash. I'm just going to be reiterating them right now. When we brought up mental health, they said that slowing the reopening of schools is worse for people's mental health than being in a pod. However, I would like to say learning pods are not what is slowing schools from reopening. This is an absurd claim to make. These learning pods are generally safer than a lot of other things that are leading to the COVID-19 spread. There are essential workers, there are people who are simply irresponsible, and there are just a bunch of other people who are breaking regulations. We see this in the status quo. Cases are going up. Do you think that cases are going up so drastically because of learning pods? No, they're not. They're going up because people need to work and people are sick of the COVID-19 quarantine and are wanting to get outside. Secondly, they talk about disabled students actually having an advantage because of distance learning. However, this is so untrue. We brought up the statistic in my first speech. A lot of parents of disabled kids are thinking of holding their kids back because of how hard distance learning is for disabled children. So because of this fact, this claim is completely false. They also say that 504s provide for free learning pods, but no school actually does it. No, the schools are mandated to provide for these learning pods, as well as if you had the opportunity to put your disabled child in a free learning pod with a professional that would be able to help them, would you do it? That is what this resolution is about. It's whether you would do it. So if you had that opportunity, would you do it? Yes, you would. They also talk about the safety of children in their homes alone, and they say that all families who can afford a pod can afford a full-time babysitter. 1, pods do not have to be expensive. 2, some pods like these 504 pods are absolutely free. And 3, splitting the money of one caretaker amongst 4 families is far less expensive than paying one caretaker that same amount. It's literally 4 times the amount of money or 3 times the amount of money. So you cannot say if you can afford a babysitter, you can afford a pod. This is just completely disproportionate in how much of an economic impact it would have on the family and is false. So yeah, they also talk about the COVID-19 spread and how this is drastically contributing to it. Again, these learning pods are not contributing that much to the COVID-19 spread. They're not slowing us from going back to school. All of their impacts rest on COVID ending and how learning pods are preventing COVID from ending. No, there's so many other things that exist in the status quo that are preventing COVID from ending, such as herd immunity being so far in the future and a vaccine not being anywhere near plausible. So let's talk about these weighing mechanisms. They get the net benefits of almost nothing, and we get the net benefits of people's mental health being saved. Teenagers will have lower suicide rates, lower deaths, okay? Disabled children will not be held back and will not be put at a educational disadvantage simply because of their learning disability and because of these unprecedented times. And kids will not be left home alone, and parents won't have to quit their jobs in order to avoid this if you choose to send your kid to a learning pod. So because we get the impacts of mental health, we get the impacts of helping disabled children, and we get the impacts of preserving the safety of children during this COVID-19 pandemic, I strongly urge a vote for the negation. Thank you.
Awesome. So I'm going to be introducing 2 main voters, just general weighing claims across the board. Is everyone ready? All right. My time begins now. There are two main reasons why we're winning this debate today. First of all, we're clearly winning on structural violence. Let's go to the second dissat. They tell you that learning pods fundamentally do not cost a lot. And they say we provide no warrants that prove that it costs a lot. This is fundamentally untrue. Look to our warrant where we state that in a survey, when asked if they plan to join a pod, several parents surveyed in an Ipsos-run community panel of 310 parents said the cost for pods or even moderately priced tutoring was not financially achievable. They provide no warrants that prove that it is financially achievable other than conjectures and vague assumptions, where we have a tangible survey that was conducted recently that stated that parents literally stated that they could not afford moderately priced tutoring or a pod. Think about it, Judge. You're essentially employing a teacher for multiple days of the week. Even if you split a cost among 4 families, that's still an enormous cost. Otherwise, you're criminally underpaying the teacher for teaching your child. Think about it. There's no possible way that a non-socioeconomically well-off family is going to be able to afford paying a teacher to teach multiple children, as illustrated by the fact they literally stated in a survey that they could not afford this. If you have to hire a tutor, let's say this tutor gets paid a minimum wage of $15. Let's say you go to learning about 5 hours a day. This is around $400 a week. How can someone that can barely afford food afford this cost? Fundamentally, the only response they make here is based off of a faulty assumption that parents are going to be able to afford this. And we see this through warrantation, through calculation, through basic math and logic. It's fundamentally untrue to state that parents can afford this if they're socioeconomically not well off. Now, they make this point about how somehow 504 plans are going to provide for free learning pods. This is, again, just gut check this. How is a school district, even if it's mandated, going to pay for not only their own teachers, but also pay multiple other teachers' salaries to to teach these learning pods when they also have to pay for them to teach their own students in class? This just doesn't make sense. Just because it's mandated doesn't mean that money just magically appears. That's like saying COVID doesn't exist because it's mandated that people stay inside. People, even if it's mandated, doesn't mean that it necessarily is possible for it to happen. School districts that are not well off cannot pay the salaries of their teachers as well as multiply that salary so that they can go pay for learning pods. That just doesn't make any sense, which means that yes, in theory, a free learning pod is a good idea, but that's just not the reality that we live in. Now, the second point we're winning on here is death. Death is the biggest impact in this round, and it is inevitable because the fact is interacting with anyone will increase your chances by however percent by lowering it to because you're interacting with people, whereas in a distance learning, you're lowering it to 0% because you're not interacting with people. Now, they make this claim that it's not because of learning pods that COVID exists. And we concede this. Learning pods are not the sole reason that COVID-19 exists, but we're saying if an outbreak happens in a learning pod, that school is not going to open for a very long time, because if that happens, then students will not, or teachers will not be able to take the risk that one of their kids will die or contract the disease. At the end of the day, while we agree that mental health is important, death and the potential that students or multiple students could contract this disease and die is a much bigger impact than students having poor mental health. And again, we're not minimizing how big of an impact mental health is, but at the end of the day, our impacts are much larger, and the potential impacts of placing your child in a learning pod, having them contract COVID-19 and die, is a much bigger impact. So we should be winning this round. Now, they state that 2 to 3 students is not going to increase the amount of cases. Now we give you 3-pronged links here, multiple pieces of analysis that prove that it's not just 2 to 3 students. Either teachers teach multiple pods or parents have to teach these pods. They don't respond to this analysis at all. It's either teachers having to go around between multiple pods, potentially spreading it to dozens of children, or you don't have a learning pod at all. So it's not just these 2 to 3 kids. It's the teachers that are interacting with multiple kids. If you have multiple kids in your house, then you have them in different pods. Like my partner said, that's about 100 people that you could potentially be getting COVID from, because the teacher could pick up COVID from any one of her students in her pods and ultimately transmit that disease to other individuals. They underestimate the capacity that this has to do great damage in terms of COVID health. Now, at the end of the day, what my opponents do not understand is the mental health implications of a family member quite literally dying. They make this enormous case about mental health, but at the end of the day, what really harms mental health is if one of your friends or if you yourself contract COVID. Okay.
It's a weighing claim. It's like why, like,
yeah, I think
about
sorry. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, this is, I did state it in my first speech where I said my impact was decreasing quality of life. And I said, if you or a family member gets COVID, that decreases your quality of life. So mental health is just another way of saying that, but judge's discretion. Cool. Resuming time now. At the end of the day, we are the internal link to mental health. We have the biggest impacts in this round with death and the potential of COVID spread. We are the only team left standing with 2 fully fleshed out advantages because my opponents do not fully respond to the structural violence advantage here by simply stating this is a cost-effective tool when it simply isn't, as illustrated by surveys, math, and fundamental logic. At the end of the day, the affirmation is winning this debate due to the severity of their impacts and the probability of their case. Thank you.
Good debate, guys.
Yeah, such fun. You guys are really good.
Yeah, you too.
Ew.
Wait, so what happens now?
Can we come back in? Can we come back in 15 minutes?
Yeah.
No.